The 600,000 Israelites and their families marched out of Egypt under the cover of the night, a vast celebratory procession of newly freed slaves. Their escape was swift and decisive, carrying the wealth of their former masters, a people finally delivered by the mighty hand of God. Their initial movements were guided not by maps, but by a miraculous, dual-natured signal from the Almighty. A towering pillar of cloud led them during the day, shading their massive numbers from the desert sun. At night, the cloud became a brilliant, blazing pillar of fire, illuminating their path and ensuring their continued momentum. This divine guidance was a visible testament to God's presence, yet the path ahead was fraught with terrifying, unseen danger. God deliberately led the Israelites toward a precarious, inescapable geographic trap near the shores of the Red Sea. They encamped near Pi-Hahiroth, a location seemingly chosen to hem them in completely. To their west lay the wilderness, impassable and waterless, leading only to dehydration and death. To their east stretched the vast, turbulent waters of the Red Sea, a barrier that defied human crossing. To their south and north were formidable natural obstacles, mountains and rugged terrain that sealed off any easy escape route. This placement was an intentional setup, designed to test their faith and bait their former enemy into a final, catastrophic confrontation. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, Pharaoh's short-lived fear and grief quickly curdled into rage and regret over the colossal loss of his slave labor. The economic impact of their departure was staggering, and the memory of their defeat was an unbearable insult to his pride. His counselors joined in his fury, lamenting, "What have we done? Why have we let Israel go from serving us?" The realization that the entire engine of their empire had walked away galvanized the tyrannical king into a final, desperate act of war. The decision was made to mobilize the full, terrifying might of the Egyptian military machine. Pharaoh quickly gathered his elite forces, a colossal and terrifying army comprised of 600 of his best chariots, each one a lethal armored instrument of war. These were the tanks of the ancient world, fast, deadly, and driven by the best military minds in the empire. He personally led the massive pursuit, driven by a vengeful fury and an absolute conviction that he would drag his former slaves back to bondage. The thunder of thousands of hooves and the metallic rattle of the chariots echoed across the desert as they bore down on the defenseless Hebrew camp. The tension of the relentless pursuit was a terrifying reality, closing in fast. The sight that greeted the Israelites was one of paralyzing terror. The massive dust cloud of the approaching Egyptian army, visible on the distant horizon. The joyous freedom of a few days earlier instantly evaporated, replaced by crippling fear and overwhelming despair. They could clearly see the inescapable trap, the massive army behind them and the boundless sea before them. The reality of their vulnerability. A disorganized rabble of freed slaves versus the world's most feared army smashed their tentative faith. A collective, panicked scream of fear and accusation rose from the desperate crowd. The people immediately turned on Moses, their newly appointed leader, with bitter, venomous complaints. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness?" They cried, their voices thick with panic and resentment. They remembered the security of their servitude, forgetting the whip and the bondage, choosing to embrace their fear. They accused Moses of intentionally leading them to this desolate spot for a cruel mass execution. Their fear was so profound that they shouted the ultimate betrayal, "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Moses stood firm amidst the torrent of accusations and the paralyzing sight of the approaching enemy, delivering a crucial, powerful command of faith. "Do not be afraid," he declared, his voice cutting through the panic of the vast crowd. He instructed them to maintain their position and simply observe the impending, stunning display of divine power. "Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today," he commanded, demanding stillness and spiritual focus over panicked flight. He promised that the Egyptians they saw that day would never be seen again. The tension was acute. The Hebrews had to choose between their fear and the word of their leader. The Lord spoke to Moses, commanding an end to the mere act of prayer and the beginning of decisive physical action. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." God commanded the people to stop lamenting and start moving toward the seemingly impossible barrier. The command was counterintuitive, demanding that they march directly into the sea itself. Then the Lord delivered the specific supernatural instructions for the miracle. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water. The physical act of Moses was to be the catalyst for the ultimate demonstration of God's power. As the massive Egyptian army rapidly closed the distance, the pillar of cloud, the constant guide, suddenly and dramatically shifted its position. It moved from its forward position at the head of the Hebrew camp to their rear, placing itself directly between the two forces. This was the moment of divine intervention, a sudden, miraculous deployment of the covenant protector. The cloud transformed into a wall of darkness for the Egyptians, plunging their advance into confusion and blindness. But for the Israelites, the pillar of fire shone brightly, continuing to illuminate their path and their position. The presence of the pillar of cloud was an immense, insurmountable, and terrifying wall that kept the Egyptian war machine at bay. The professional soldiers were unable to make any meaningful progress in the supernatural gloom, the wall of darkness confusing their ranks. All night long, the two vast companies were held in a desperate, standoffish tension by this invisible, fiery barrier. The Egyptians knew their prey was near, but they were powerless to strike, immobilized by the divine guard. This miraculous intervention provided the precious hours Moses needed to execute the terrifying command. At God's command, Moses stretched out his hand over the towering waves of the Red Sea, a solitary, desperate figure challenging the ocean itself. And then, the impossible began. The waters did not merely recede, but violently split, forming two gigantic, shimmering walls. The Lord sent a strong east wind that blew with unrelenting force all through the night, driving the sea back and exposing the seabed. The water was held back by a force defying all physics, a liquid chasm opened by the very breath of God. The tension of the wind and the splitting water created a deafening, terrifying sound. The Israelites, seeing the colossal, miraculous dry path open before them, were commanded to march forward. They stepped onto the newly revealed ground, treading on the muddy, firm seabed, surrounded by towering walls of water on both their left and right. This was a supreme test of faith, to walk between two vast columns of water held back only by the invisible Word of God. Every step was a commitment to the divine, a rejection of the terrifying sight above them. The entire multitude, men, women, children, and animals, began the massive, desperate, overnight crossing. As soon as the Israelites began their descent into the sea, the Egyptians realized the nature of the colossal, terrifying miracle. Their initial confusion gave way to a renewed, vengeful determination to pursue the fleeing Hebrews into the dry seabed. They saw the dry, accessible ground and charged their powerful chariots directly into the chasm, certain that their military superiority would prevail. This was the fatal, arrogant mistake. They assumed the path opened for God's people was also available to God's enemies. The massive chase was on, with the thunder of hooves echoing in the dark, watery valley. The pursuing Egyptians, moving across the slippery, hastily dried seabed, quickly began to experience the supernatural consequences of their hubris. The Lord began to throw the Egyptian camp into complete confusion, interfering with their machinery and their movements. Their chariot wheels began to clog and drag, making their progress slow, difficult, and frighteningly unstable. The military machine, once a symbol of perfect efficiency, began to grind to a terrifying halt. The Egyptian soldiers finally recognized the cosmic nature of the battle they were fighting. The soldiers screamed in terror, acknowledging the terrifying truth of their situation. "Let us flee from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." This was a profound, agonizing moment of realization, a complete acknowledgement of the superiority of the God of the Hebrews. The fear of the divine warrior finally surpassed the fury of their king. They attempted to retreat, to save themselves from the terrifying supernatural interference that was destroying their ranks. But their recognition of God's power came tragically late, as the entire Israelite multitude reached the distant western shore. As the last Israelite stepped safely onto the high western bank, the Lord commanded Moses to deliver the final, crushing, irreversible blow. "Stretch out your hand over the sea," the Lord commanded, "so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." This was the definitive climax, the moment of ultimate divine judgment and final salvation. Moses immediately obeyed, the command given and executed with the swift finality of a judge delivering a sentence. The entire vast multitude held its breath, awaiting the cosmic reaction. The immense towering walls of water that had held back all night suddenly and violently collapsed with a catastrophic roar. The entire weight of the Red Sea crashed down upon the Egyptian army, a deluge of impossible power that covered the entire seabed. The mighty chariots, the armored horses, and every single soldier were instantly overwhelmed by the surging return of the ocean. This was a clean, final, and complete annihilation of the world's greatest military power. Not a single Egyptian survived the terrifying, crushing force of the returning waters. The Israelites stood upon the distant shore, witnesses to the complete miraculous destruction of their former masters, seeing the true end of their bondage. The shore was littered with the drowned bodies and the shattered remnants of the Egyptian army, a visible, undeniable proof of their liberation. The magnitude of the event finally cemented their faith, an awe-inspiring, impossible miracle witnessed by every man, woman, and child. They saw the colossal power of God in a way that forever etched their obedience into their memory. In response to this spectacular act of deliverance, the people believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses, their fear replaced by overwhelming faith. They broke into spontaneous, fervent worship, led by Moses and his sister Miriam. This collective act of praise, known as the Song of the Sea, was a spontaneous expression of gratitude and newfound trust. The song celebrated the Lord as a mighty warrior, a triumphant redeemer, and a faithful protector who had executed justice perfectly. The fear that once motivated their complaints was washed away forever by the waves. The parting of the Red Sea remains the ultimate story of faith when the path looks impossible. It proves that when human effort fails and the enemy is closing in, God not only creates a solution but destroys the threat forever. The impossible barrier of the sea was not a roadblock but a weapon, transformed by divine power into the instrument of final deliverance. It is an enduring lesson that God's methods may be terrifyingly unconventional, but his faithfulness is absolute, always making a safe, sure way for his people through the most impossible obstacles.